The most dangerous lie in the world isn't the one you tell others, it's the one you tell yourself about the people you love. The air in my study was so thick with cigar smoke and tension that I could taste it on the back of my tongue, a bitter, acrid flavor that reminded me of stale coffee and interrogation rooms. I am Henry Vance. I am 78 years old. I wear orthotic shoes and cardigans that smell of cedar. To my neighbors in this quiet Northern Virginia cul-de-sac, I am a retired logistics coordinator for the State Department who spends his twilight years pruning roses and reading dense biographies of Winston Churchill. To my son David, I am something else entirely. I am a senile relic. I am a vault with a rusty lock. I am an obstacle. David was pacing in front of my mahogany desk, wearing a hole in the Persian rug I bought in Istanbul 40 years ago. He was sweating. I could see the sheen on his forehead, reflecting the light of the brass desk lamp. He wore a suit that was too shiny, polyester masquerading as wool, and a watch that was too big for his wrist, a gaudy thing meant to signal success to people who didn't know any better. But I knew better. I knew exactly what that watch cost, and I knew exactly how overdrawn the account was that paid for it. "Just sign the power of attorney, Dad," David said, slamming his hand down on the leather blotter. The sound cracked through the room like a pistol shot. "We've been over this. It's for your own good. You're forgetting things, you're leaving the stove on, I looked at him. I looked at the boy I had taught to ride a pike, the man who now stood before me with desperation clawing at his eyes. "I haven't left the stove on since 1998, David," I said. My voice was quiet, steady, the voice I used when de-escalating a situation. David gestured wildly to the man sitting in the wingback chair in the corner. "He's fixating on the past. He's in denial. Mr. Klein cleared his throat. He was a lawyer of the lowest order, a man who smelled of cheap cologne and ambulance chasing. He adjusted his glasses, looking at me with a pity that was as fake as his tan. "Henry," Klein said, his voice oily, "your son is just concerned. The cognitive decline is, well, it's apparent. The narrative David has shared with the court is compelling. Confusion, aggression, mismanagement of assets. The narrative. That was a polite word for a lie. David had been building this narrative for months." Small comments to the neighbors. He was planting seeds of doubt, watering them with feigned concern, preparing for the harvest. I knew why. I didn't need to ask. Last night, while David thought I was asleep in my recliner watching Wheel of Fortune, I was in this study. I wasn't reading Churchill. I was using a backdoor decryption key I had kept for my days at the bureau, a little souvenir from a life I wasn't allowed to talk about. I tracked his bank accounts. I followed the digital breadcrumbs. David wasn't just broke. He was leveraged to the hilt. He had sunk everything into a cryptocurrency startup that was actually a Ponzi scheme run by a man currently under indictment in the Southern District of New York. David needed liquidity. He needed a lot of it, and he needed it fast to cover his tracks before the SEC auditors started asking questions about the investors he had brought in, his friends, his golf buddies, people who trusted him. He needed my house. He needed my pension. He needed me out of the way. "I am perfectly lucid, David," I said, locking eyes with him, "and I am not signing over the house. Not today." David's face flushed a deep, ugly red. The vein in his neck bulged. "Can you imagine?" he yelled, leaning over the desk, invading my space. "You're living in the past. You think you're some big shot because you filed paperwork for 30 years? You are a bureaucrat, Dad, a paper pusher. You don't understand how the modern world works." A retired fool. The words hung in the air, vibrating with a cruelty that only a child can inflict on a parent. I looked down at my hands. They were spotted with age, the skin thin as parchment. But I remembered what these hands had done. These hands had defused a bomb in a basement in Beirut with 30 seconds on the clock. These hands had shaken hands with 3 presidents. These hands had signed off on operations that don't exist in any official record. Operations that kept the world spinning while people like David slept soundly in their beds.
but to my son, they were just old hands that shook when I poured coffee. I felt a profound, aching sadness wash over me. It wasn't anger, it was grief. I realized then that I had succeeded too well. I had protected him from the darkness of my work so he could have a normal life. I wanted him to be soft. I wanted him to be safe. And he had used that safety to grow entitled, weak, and blind.
I sat there, letting his insults wash over me, listening to the man who shared my blood call me stupid. And I realized that the greatest cover identity I ever created wasn't for an operation. I hid the truth to keep him safe, and now he was using that silence as a weapon against me. If you have ever sacrificed your glory for your family, dimming your own light so they could shine, only to have them treat your humility as weakness, take a moment to subscribe, because I am about to show you that just because a sword is sheathed, it doesn't mean it's dull. And sometimes the only way to save someone is to draw it. Mr. Vance, Klein interjected, sensing the volatility in the room. He leaned forward, playing the reasonable cop. If you don't sign voluntarily, we have a competency hearing scheduled for Monday. David has the medical affidavits from Dr. Evans, who, by the way, agrees that your memory is failing. We will take the house, Henry. The court will grant it. This is the easy way. It was a threat, a naked, ugly threat wrapped in legal jargon. They were going to drag me through court. They were going to paint me as a dementia patient. They were going to strip me of my dignity and warehouse me in a facility until I died, just so David could pay off his gambling debts. I looked at the clock on the wall. 1400 hours, right on time. I reached into my desk drawer. David flinched, perhaps thinking I was reaching for a checkbook, or maybe he thought I was finally reaching for a pen to sign his document. I wasn't. I reached for a specific file. It was a thin, red folder with no label. I tried to protect you, David, I said softly. I tried to keep you out of the crossfire. I thought if I kept you in the dark, you would grow toward the light. David screamed, spit flying from his lips. Stop rambling about crossfire. You worked in logistics. Just then, a sound cut through the shouting. Knock, knock, knock. It wasn't a polite tap. It wasn't the knock of a neighbor borrowing sugar. It was a heavy, authoritative sound, 3 hard raps that rattled the heavy oak door in its frame. It was the knock of law enforcement. It was the knock of consequences arriving. David froze. He spun toward the hallway. David looked at the door, then back at me, his eyes narrowing. Did you call the cops? He stormed out of the study, marching down the hallway. I heard him fling the door open, ready to yell, ready to use his indignation as a shield. David, barked, his voice dripping with annoyance. Then silence. Absolute, heavy silence. I stood up. My knees popped, but I straightened my spine. I buttoned my cardigan. I adjusted my glasses. I walked slowly out of the study and down the hall. Standing in the open doorway were 4 men. They were not local police. They were wearing dark, tailored suits that cost more than David's car. They were earpieces. Their jackets were cut loose enough to hide the sidearms I knew were strapped to their ribs. They stood with a stillness that screamed capability. The man in front was tall, with iron gray hair and eyes like flint. He had a scar running through his left eyebrow. It was Assistant Director Jim Miller. We worked the Berlin desk together in '89. We had buried bodies together, metaphorically speaking, of course. David was blocking the way, looking confused, looking small. Look, I said we're busy. My father is unwell. We're handling a medical situation. You can't just... Miller didn't even look at David. He looked through him. He looked past his shoulder, into the shadows of the hallway where I was standing. Miller's eyes locked onto mine. His expression didn't change. He snapped his heels together. The sound was sharp, precise. He raised his hand. And he salutes. It wasn't a casual wave. It was a formal, military-grade salute, held with rigid respect. Director Vance, Miller said. His voice boomed, deep and resonant, carrying the weight of the entire federal government behind it. Secure line established.
David turned around slowly. His face was pale. He looked at Miller, saluting a man in a cardigan. He looked at me. "David," whispered. The word fell out of his mouth like a stone. "Dad, what is he talking about?" I walked past him. I didn't look at him. I walked straight to Miller. "At ease, Jim," I said. Miller dropped the salute. A grim smile touched his lips. "Good to see you, sir. We got your signal at 0800 hours. The encryption on the drive you sent over was standard, but the contents..." "Wait," David stammered, stepping between us, trying to regain control of a reality that was dissolving under his feet like wet sand. "You can't be here. This is a private residence. I am his power of attorney, or I will be on Monday." Miller looked at David for the first time. He looked at him with the cold indifference of a man who hunts terrorists for a living and finds a gnat in his way.
"I am Assistant Director Miller of the Federal Bureau of Investigation," he said, flashing a badge that caught the afternoon sun. David's face went the color of old ash. His knees buckled slightly. "I didn't call the police to protect you from you, David," I said, my voice calm, the voice of the director returning after years of dormancy. I turned back toward the study, where the lawyer Klein was peering out, looking like a rat sensing the ship going down. "Come in, gentlemen," I said to the agents. The silence in the hallway wasn't just quiet. It was the sound of a universe realigning itself after a tectonic shift. David stood there, his arm hanging limp at his side, the tendons in his neck standing out like cords. He looked at Assistant Director Miller, a man who wore authority like a second skin. Then, slowly, painfully, he turned his head to look at me. The color had drained from his face, leaving him looking gray and waxy, like something molded from clay that hadn't quite set. His mouth opened and closed, a fish gasping for air on a dock, but no sound came out. He looked like a man who had spent his life thinking he was looking at a sheep, only to watch it reach up, unzip its fleece, and reveal the wolf underneath.
He didn't look at him with anger. He didn't look at him with pity. He looked at him with the cold indifference of a man who hunts terrorists for a living and finds a gnat buzzing in his ear. "I am Assistant Director Miller of the Federal Bureau of Investigation," he said, flashing a badge that caught the afternoon sun streaming through the transom window. David's face went the color of old ash. His knees buckled slightly, and he had to grab the doorframe to stay upright. "I didn't call the police to protect me from you, David," I said, my voice calm, the voice of the director returning after years of dormancy. I turned back toward the study, where the lawyer Klein was peering out, looking like a rat sensing the ship going down. He was stuffing papers into his briefcase with frantic, jerky movements. "Come in, gentlemen," I said to the agents standing behind Miller. The agents moved past us, a fluid wave of dark suits and professionalism. They entered the study. One of them put a hand on Klein's shoulder and forced him back into the chair. I walked back into the room. I walked behind my desk. I sat down in my leather chair. I didn't look like a retired fool anymore. I looked like the man who ran the counterintelligence division for 20 years. I looked like the man who decided who lived and who died in the shadows of the Cold War. "You called me a fool, David," I said, picking up the thin red folder I had reached for earlier. You said I didn't understand the modern world. I opened the folder. I tossed the folder onto the desk. It slid across the mahogany, smooth and fast, and hit David in the chest. He caught it instinctively. He opened it. His hands were shaking so hard the papers rattled. Inside were printouts, not just bank statements. These were transcripts of his encrypted chats, his emails, his wire transfers, his text messages with his partners in the Cayman Islands, discussing how to liquidate my estate before I died. David breathed, staring at a transcript of a conversation he had yesterday. These are encrypted. I used Tor. I used a VPN. I helped write the code that breaks Tor, son. You were playing checkers. David collapsed into the guest chair. The arrogance was gone. The entitlement was gone. The bluster about modern finance and being a visionary was gone. All that was left was a scared boy who realized he had drastically underestimated the only man who ever truly loved him.
"Dad," he pleaded, tears welling in his eyes, spilling over onto his cheeks. "Dad, please. It was a mistake. I got in over my head. They were going to kill me if I didn't pay. I just needed the house. I would have paid you back." "You were going to put me in a home," I said. My voice didn't waver. "You were going to drug me to make me compliant. I heard you on the phone with Dr. Evans. That's in the file, too. Make him docile, you said." David sobbed. It was a broken, ugly sound. Miller stepped forward. He pulled a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. "David Vance," Miller said, reciting the words I had heard 1,000 times. The agents moved in. They pulled David up from the chair. They spun him around. They cuffed his hands behind his back. The same hands that had slammed on my desk minutes ago, demanding my submission. "David!" screamed David as they dragged him toward the door. He twisted, looking back at me, his face a mask of terror. "Do something! You're the director! You can stop this! You can make a call! Please?" I looked at him. I felt the grief, heavy and sharp, a physical pain in the center of my chest. I wanted to save him. The father in me wanted to make the call, to pull the strings, to bury the evidence and send him to a rehab somewhere quiet. But the director knew better. The director knew that a rot like this doesn't heal. It spreads. "I am doing something, David," I said softly. "I'm teaching you the lesson I should have taught you 20 years ago. Actions have consequences." They dragged him out. I heard his screams echoing down the hallway, then out into the street, until the heavy door slammed shut, cutting them off. Klein was let out behind him, pale and silent, knowing better than to say a word. The house was suddenly quiet. The ticking of the grandfather clock returned, steady and indifferent. Miller stayed behind. He walked over to the sidebar. He pulled 2 glasses of the scotch sitting there, an 18-year-old single malt I saved for special occasions. He didn't ask. He just poured. He walked over and handed one to me. "I'm sorry, Henry," Miller said, raising his glass slightly. "He was," I said, taking the glass. The amber liquid swirled, catching the light, but he made his choice. "The Bureau appreciates the tip," Miller said. "His scheme, it wasn't just you. He was targeting veterans' pensions. He was stealing from men who bled for this country. I just cleaned up my own mess, Jim," I said. I raised him.
"You didn't fail him," Miller said. "You protected him." Miller finished his drink. He set the glass down. "I'll handle the paperwork. You won't have to testify, unless you want to." Miller nodded. He turned and walked out, leaving me alone in the study. I walked to the window. I pulled back the heavy velvet curtain. I watched the black SUVs drive away, their lights flashing silently in the twilight. I saw my son in the back of the second vehicle. His face was pressed against the glass, looking back at the house, looking back at the fortune he tried to steal, looking back at the father he thought was a fool. I let the curtain fall. I was alone. The house was empty. I was 78 years old. My cover was blown. My son was in federal custody. My heart was broken. But as I took a sip of the scotch, feeling the burn in my chest, I straightened my spine. I adjusted my cuffs. I looked at the reflection in the window. I didn't see a victim. I didn't see a retired fool. I saw Henry Vance, and I was still on duty.